Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to those of you that have joined us online. I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome you all to our second seminar of the Team Dufferin series, which focuses on bringing more information to our residents, our businesses, and those in our community with regards to the tariffs and this whole discussion around, are we going to have tariffs? Are we not going to have tariffs? How does it impact the economy? Which sectors of the economy does it impact? And how? So to bring this conversation forward a little bit more with some more information with regards to agriculture and how the tariff sort of conversation is evolving with respect to agriculture, we do have Ryan Gibson, from the University of Guelph. And so this seminar will take a closer look at Dufferin County's rural economic landscape with a spotlight on vulnerable sectors such as the agri-food industry and manufacturing and the challenges and opportunities shaping their future. The event is free and open for all, so as you guys know, you've joined us here with no cost, and that's thanks to the generous donation and time of our speakers, as well as our economic development staff that have worked really hard in putting this together for the community. And for future seminars and engagement opportunities, please be sure to look out in your inboxes, as there will be more to come. This is a 5-part series, so there will be an additional 3 that will sort of give us an overall rounded approach to the tariff discussion and overall Dufferin County's economic landscape and what we're hoping to do moving forward in the future. So now to move on to our speaker, Ryan Gibson has a deep intrigue and respect for rural communities, rural people, and the events and how they shape their lives. Growing up, witnessing the transformations in rural development, agriculture, and their influence on communities instilled a fascination and commitment to rural issues. Ryan is a Libero professor in regional economic development at the University of Guelph. Ryan's research and community engagement focuses on rural and regional development, governance, immigration, philanthropy, and public policy. Ryan is the past president of both the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation and Canadian Community Economic Development Network. So moving on, before we begin today's seminar, okay, sorry, bit of a mic glitch there. I do want to do a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Dufferin County resides within the traditional territory and ancestral lands of the Tinitani and Attawandaron, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples. We acknowledge that various municipalities within the County of Dufferin reside within the treaty lands named under the Haldeman Deed of 1784 and 2 of the Williams Treaties of 1818 and Treaty 18, the Nottawasaga Purchase, and Treaty 19. I'm going to butcher this, and how do you say it? Adjutant's Treaty. I apologize if I said that wrong. These traditional treaties upon which we live and learn are steeped in rich Indigenous history and traditions. It is with this statement that we declare to honor and respect the past and present connection of Indigenous peoples with this land, its waterways, and its resources. So now if we can give a warm welcome to Ryan Gibson.
And I believe red is on. Great. Thanks, everyone, for coming out, spending your afternoon, especially on a beautiful day like today. And it's exciting to be here in this a bit chaotic time that we're in terms of tariffs, changes, and everything that's going on around us. I was saying earlier that I anticipate some of this information might be dated by the time I actually present it, because the pace of change has just been so dramatic over the last few years. But what I'm hoping to do today is maybe give a bit of a roadmap here in terms of a bit of an introduction to myself and the lenses and the experiences that I'm bringing to this. We'll look at maybe who is some of these rural communities and these rural economies that are being impacted. But one of the pieces I wanted to stress today is that this isn't our first economic downturn. This is not our first storm that we're weathering. This is something that we've done many, many times before, and wanted to look at what we maybe have learned or perhaps should have learned from past economic downturns, because there's some really important lessons in there that we either we want to champion to do again, or we want to actually not do again because it didn't work the last time we tried it. We'll look at some vulnerability, in particular here in Dufferin County. Where might some of that vulnerability be in the current tariff discussion, as well as some opportunities for moving forward. And on that, I'll share some suggestions from other jurisdictions that have worked well. They may or may not be relevant for Dufferin County at the end of the day, but I'm hoping they serve to be a bit of a catalyst in terms of things that might be happening here. And at any time, feel free to pipe in with a question. We have lots of time at the end, but if there's something in the middle, don't hesitate to wave fanatically. We can chat about it at that point in time. And for those that are online, I think you can raise your hand or put a comment in the chat box, and someone will convey that my direction. So maybe a bit about myself and why I'm here. My family is from Manitoba, southern Manitoba. I live in Guelph at the moment, but I grew up as a settler family on the traditional territories of the Dakota, the Anishinaabe, and the Red River Métis in southern Manitoba. I grew up on a very much an agricultural family in both grain and in livestock. I grew up, this is my hometown, if you can see it on the map there, or on the screen. Not a lot, not very large by any stretch of the imagination. And over the years, I was looking through some of the history books, and from 1882, a lovely description of my hometown. It was the deputy minister within the mounted police wanted to know what was in the community, and they wrote back saying it consists of one log house, a stable, which from a distance could easily be mistaken as a snowbank. That was my community. So a very small community, less than 300 people in the greater community area, all of those being very much agricultural based. This is what I grew up kind of with a backdrop. This is from the National Film Board, but I grew up in the rural West at a time when we saw high interest rates, we saw an exodus out of agriculture, we saw huge challenges in community development, and most importantly, we started to see a change in the economy of rural communities, and this was the movement of a pioneer grain elevator from one community to the other in Saskatchewan, but was very telling of the time. These were, very iconic images of agriculture in Western Canada that now were being relocated because the economy had fundamentally changed. The livelihood of people had changed. And so this is my background. I grew up in a very small community. I thought to be successful, one had to leave that community. And so I went out into the world to find things to do and places to be. And ironically discovered that as I discovered all of that, where I wanted to be was actually where I'd started. But it took me a long way to figure that all out. So by training, I'm an economic geographer focused on rural areas. My interests are really about the future of rural places, the future of rural people, the future of rural environments, and those economies. I'm a faculty member at the University of Guelph in the Planning and Development program. And I also hold a chair position in what's called the Libro Professorship of Regional Economic Development. And if you've never heard of that, that's absolutely okay. It was created about 10 years ago, and it was a named professorship at the university that was created through a $1 million gift between Libro Credit Union and two farm families. And they gifted the money to the university to create a position that focused on rural and regional economic development. What does the future look like? How do we help communities? How do we help farmers? How do we help other actors that are out there navigate whatever that future, whatever the priorities are for them? We have a team of about 20 to 25 students that are working on projects ranging everywhere from community economic development to immigration and how do we create welcoming communities for newcomers, looking at workforce development, looking at policy evaluation, place-based development, and the list goes on and on and on. But if you'd like more information, you can see there's a web page there. You're more than welcome to click on that, take a look at the things that are there. All of the resources are free. But there's also a bit of a calling card that if there are things that you or your organizations are working on that need more people to help out on, that need someone to dive into data or to do a bit of a scan, please by all means give us a shout. In the Rural Planning and Development program, we have about 125 master's level students that are all interested in the future of rural places. And so if there's something that you've got on the go that might be of value to have some extra hands helping out, please don't hesitate to give us a shout. We might be able to find somebody that can help contribute towards that. There you go. Yep. So that's a little bit about myself, the work that I do. I was hoping to get a bit of a sense of who's here also. So if you've got a phone or a tablet, you're more than welcome to scan that QR code that's on the screen. If you're joining us from online, please feel free to do that as well. But I'm just curious about what affiliation people have in the room. If you don't have a device, don't worry about filling it out. You can answer the question to yourself. You'll be guaranteed to get it right on that instance. But just curious, what hats are people wearing that are participating either in the room or online? And with the goodwill of the technology deities that are around us today, this should work. And it's starting to populate on that front. So great to see we've got local government folks. We have some folks from the provincial government, some from other organizations that maybe weren't listed there on that side of things. It's always interesting to see just who's in the room in terms of what's happening on that side of things. There you go.
So Bill's a farmer?
Bill's a farmer. We'll put him up there on his own category for that. So that's wonderful. I also had one or two other questions, I think. What best describes where you live in terms of population? Are you in a community with less than 1,000 residents? Are you in a community with kind of 1,000 to 10,000 residents? Are you in a community that's somewhere between 10,000 and maybe 100,000? Or are you in a community that is, over 100,000 residents? And I'll let you determine what your community is. I struggle with this question. I think yesterday someone asked me, where did I live? And I asked them, what do they really want to know? Where do I get my mail? Where do I work? Where am I physically at the moment? Where do I feel like I belong? What did they want to know? And that poor person, I think, regretted asking me the question, as they had not actually thought about it. They just wanted to put something in the computer on that front. So great to see that half the people are in a community under 10,000. We've got some folks in communities that are maybe 10,000 to 100,000, and a few that are in maybe urban areas of over 100,000 residents. And I think this is my last question for the moment. This is a question I've been asking everyone since I was invited to come speak here. How do you describe the economy of Dufferin? In one or two, I've said one word. If you'd like to take the liberty of 2 or 3 words, nobody will prevent you from doing that. But how do you describe the economy here in Dufferin? What's that descriptor that you use? And if you don't have a device and you want to shout one out, by all means, feel free to do so. Growing, evolving. Diverse. Give people a second just to frantically type things in. I'm just impressed that no one's got a spelling error so far in the words that are appearing. Yeah, so we've got.
I want to say
cautious. Yep, okay. Good word. Yeah. And I'm guessing that maybe relates to that conservative comment that someone has shared there too. Maybe they're similar, but we've got some diversity, we've got some growing, we've got some evolving, place of opportunities, some small businesses, tight-knit community or tight-knit economy. All of this is really exciting to hear. If you want to continue to populate more one words, you're welcome to do so. If you get bored with what I'm saying, please entertain yourself and just add more words. But maybe we'll turn to what is rural and what are rural economies. And these are terms that often get used in newspapers, on the media, and they use them without necessarily telling people what they mean by it. And I remember a few years ago, I noticed that they were saying Northern Ontario was snowed in. And when you heard the news report, the area they were talking about was just outside North York. And I'm going to guess that most people in the province would not consider, just outside North York as Northern Ontario. But we see the same thing happening about rural. We see them talking in the media or in politicians talking about rural, but they're not talking necessarily about the same rural that we refer to. So just to give people a quick background, in Canada, we don't have a single definition for rural. We have multiple definitions, which makes it a little more challenging and interesting. The most common definition at the moment being used by most federal and provincial departments is less than 100,000 residents. So any community that has a less than 100,000 would be rural. That being said, we know that there are a lot of different types of rural that fit under that definition. My hometown of less than 300 people is very different than a community of 90,000 just outside the Greater Toronto region. Across the country, about 6 million Canadians live in a rural community. This number has been growing incrementally, but very small growth over the years. Here in Ontario, about 2.5 million residents live in a small town or rural place. We've had some small population growth between 2016 and 2021. However, that growth has been incredibly uneven. So not all rural communities are growing. If you wanted to predict, you probably could guess, but rural communities that are closer to larger urban centers tend to be growing faster than communities that are farther distance from urban centers. What's interesting, though, is when we think about rural communities, and this is often missed, is that rural communities compared to urban communities have a much stronger sense of belonging and sense of attachment. People feel committed to their community at a different level than you see in the cities. And this becomes really important when we start to think about planning for economic futures. We also know that there's a stronger rate of volunteerism in rural communities, and we also know there is a more frequent donation to charities and nonprofits in rural places. But what's really important, and this is a message that I will tell any politician that will give me 2 minutes to listen, is that there is incredible diversity in rural communities. There are multiple rurals at the end of the day. An agricultural rural community does not look the same as a mining rural community. It does not look the same as a fishing rural community. And we need to make sure that policymakers in our senior levels of government recognize this when they create policies or programs, that they're not just have one type of rural community in mind and think that this is going to help and support all communities across the country. In terms of rural economies, as we look at it kind of from across the country, we know that rural economies historically are more natural resource based than urban economies. Historically, this has been agriculture, this is fishing, forestry, mining, and even water exports. But we know that rural communities tend to be more natural resource based, and they tend to have less diversity. So we don't see 20 or 50 types of businesses necessarily, or sectors in the community. Maybe we see a smaller number that are there. We also know that rural economies are more seasonal, they're more intensive in terms of labor. We know that increasingly since the 1980s and onwards, we've seen a significant influence of globalization. So you're no longer competing with the community down the road. You're competing against communities in South Africa. You're competing against communities in China. You're competing against communities in Kazakhstan to produce the same products and services and to sell them. We also know that rural economies have an increasingly difficult time around labor force replacements. So as people retire, who takes over that person's position? Is that position, do we have the right skills in the community to find someone else to take that on? Do we have other barriers that might prevent people from taking on that position when someone retires or when new businesses emerge in the community? We also know that rural communities are impacted by creative destruction differently than urban places. Anyone come across creative destruction before as an idea? So if you're not familiar with it, essentially creative destruction says that as technology evolves and we get new advancements, we are able to find efficiencies or effectiveness of implementing it. And in doing so, it often means we need less human resources to do that same service. So I'm sure almost everybody here has participated in some element of this over the last 24 hours. If you went and got your groceries and scanned your own groceries, that's a form of it. Gas might purchased through without a human interaction. It might be in manufacturing. We might be using more robotics on farms for dairy farms. There might be robotics for milking that are being integrated. But all of these typically, as we introduce this new technology, these new advancements, often come at the expense of jobs. We're seeing a decrease in jobs. I'm guessing the county also is employing this in many different ways, whether it be online application forms, whether it be automated systems that are being used. But this creative destruction has a component of interest in rural economies. And I put this one in bold because it's something that our media typically misses, that the 6 million Canadians that live in rural communities is about 17% of our national population. The gross domestic product, the value of all goods and services produced by that 6 million people, that 17%, is actually 30% of Canada's national economy. So rural communities are actually carrying their weight and more when it comes to the national economy of the country. And many of our national newspapers have missed this story. We're often hearing narratives that rural communities are somehow a bad investment, that we are the poor cousin of the urban areas, that they don't want to invest money into rural because it's a bad return on investment. But in actuality, the rural economy is outperforming its share of the population. And that's a message we need to make sure is being heard by anyone that will listen. I wanted to share a few key transitions because these will start to impact, these were happening before the tariffs, but these will start to influence what we do as we move forward. These are not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. These are some of the key ones that came to my mind. The first one there is really around technology, the advancements of anything from artificial intelligence to digitization, robotics that are being introduced. They provide all sorts of opportunities for businesses to perhaps introduce them to be able to do more things better, quicker, more efficiently. But they also come with caveats. They require specialized training to often operate and design them. They often require broadband connectivity. Driving up from Guelph, I think my phone call got dropped 2 or 3 times on that front, and it might have been lucky that it was only 2 or 3 times. But this requires broadband internet. It requires cellular communication to be able to actively participate in this. And without those services, it also means that some communities are disadvantaged. Other communities can compete with them to do things they can't. We've got all sorts of demographic transitions that are taking place in rural communities across this country, Dufferin being a good example of this. We have some communities that are declining in population. We have some that are increasing. We tend to see in general an aging population in most rural communities, so an increase in the number of people that are above the age of 65. More interesting over the last 30 years has been the notion around welcoming communities. Are rural communities attracting newcomers to their community, whether they be newcomers to Canada or just new to that rural place? And we have a phenomenon called MTV. Almost 80% of all new immigrants to Canada end up in Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. But since the 1980s, 1990s, particularly in the 2000s, we've seen rural communities actively try to recruit newcomers, international migrants, to their community to set up, to start businesses, to contribute to the labor force. And so that's been an interesting transition that we've been seeing. Partnerships is the third one I would suggest here. This transition we've had for many, many, many decades. Competition between communities for whether it be hospital, limited provincial resources, or federal resources. We're seeing increasingly a role for collaboration and doing things that involve multiple stakeholders, collectively trying to do things so that we can achieve whatever the priorities are at the end of the day. We've seen an incredible empowerment of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations in Canada over the last 30, 40 years. And increasingly, priorities of many Indigenous groups are actually parallel to the priorities of rural communities. And so we're seeing an increased collaboration, increased partnerships around where are there these parallels that can be pursued either jointly or at least collaboratively so that we can find some efficiencies in those activities. This will come as no surprise to anyone that works in local government. The next one I put up on the map there was downloading. This is from senior levels of government. We have had a culture over at least the last 30, 40 years where senior levels of government pass along responsibilities to lower levels of government and say, tag, you're it. You now get to deliver this program, this service. But rarely does that responsibility ever come with financial or human resources. And so we end up with a lovely phrase that as we were doing some research a few years ago, I think I heard it in 8 of 10 communities, which was the new philosophy is do more with less. And this becomes really problematic. It means that municipalities and local governments either have to do less things with the fewer resources they have, or they have to find innovative ways to do it, whether it's through partnerships, whether it's through entrepreneurial-like activities, embedding that in the public sector. Huge challenge. And that is not going away. I think we'll continue to see that for the years ahead. The other transition, the second last one that I'll speak to just briefly, is place-based approaches, which is exciting. We've moved away from kind of these narrow, siloed perspectives of we just need to do economics, we just need to get jobs. If we have jobs, everything will be fine. We now have been looking at place-based development in terms of social, cultural, environmental, economic, but really saying what is the important to the people that live here? How do we harness these priorities so that we can move forward and achieve that? The last one I put up here is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, and this is a transition we've seen in Canada since the 1800s, but it's been more pronounced recently, and that's urban Canada viewing rural Canada as an ATM. Urban communities often are extracting things from rural areas, agricultural products, minerals, water, but they're also using rural for recreation, leisure, the getaway. But it's not seen necessarily as a two-directional relationship. It's often very one-directional. How do we get things out of rural into the cities to benefit people in the cities or businesses in the city? And so there's an interesting dynamic that's been taking place and that's getting more attention around how do we change that relationship so that it's not just, rural is not an ATM machine where urban Canada comes, punches in the magic code and out come resources, out come all of these benefits, and then they go back to the city. How do we change that dynamic? And so that's something that's been very interesting to see. And an interesting transition, and Luke's here in the room actually. This is Luke was just finishing up his thesis, defended it last week, but if you want to look at a case study on rural economic development in New Tecumseh, he's an expert, give him a shout on that. Many of these themes were part of that, but also some other interesting pieces there that you might find interesting to see how they are addressing rural economic development in this current climate. Successful rural economic development, I thought, what has been successful? If we look across the country, these are asset-based, community-centered, and entrepreneurial-based initiatives. We have moved away from the smokestack chasing of employment and trying to figure out how do we build on local priorities and local assets. It's the regional collaboration so that businesses are working with nonprofits in the schools so that everything kind of comes together. We've got infrastructure and connectivity with succession planning around businesses themselves. Interesting opportunity to look at wealth transfers. Where is wealth in a community? How can that wealth be utilized? We often think of rural places as being very lacking in financial resources, but in actuality, rural has a lot of financial assets. They just look different than urban centers. They typically look like land, they look like equipment, they might be quotas, they might be other investments, but they look different than what we would see in an urban place. And really important is that we can't take urban strategies and move them into rural and agricultural communities. We have not learned this lesson very well in Canada. Over the last 80 years, we've repeated this multiple times where we've used urban strategies, put them out into rural places, and then act surprised when they didn't work and wondered why that was the case. I'm hoping we're starting to learn that lesson, but we'll see how it moves forward. So I wanted to share a few examples from the past. The current storm that we are in the midst of at the moment is not new. Rural communities, rural economies have weathered many storms, whether we go back to the Great Depression, when we saw commodity prices and huge impacts on agricultural communities, the 1980s, the recession that we saw there, when we saw high interest rates. Does anybody remember the interest rates in the 1980s, starting in 82 and onwards? Anybody remember what they were? 18, 20% on standard loans. Yes, mortgages, car loans. So you're looking, most people today, when you talk to people and they say, oh, the interest rate is 5.5% or 6%, this is horrendous. I remember looking at the family mortgage on the house, and it was back in, I think, the mid 80s, it was 17, 18%. And so we've weathered that storm. That was a storm where we had huge economic costs of borrowing. We saw a huge downturn in agricultural communities, bankruptcies, huge loss of manufacturing jobs here in rural Ontario. We've come out of that one as well. We can go back to the 1990s where we see yet another economic recession, high interest rates that emerged. If you were out on the Atlantic coast of the country, you would have heard of the cod moratorium, where an entire industry of natural resources was closed overnight in 1992, and everyone that was directly involved in that became unemployed. Anybody that worked in the processing plants, the transportation, the legal, all of the associated services, all were closed overnight in 1992. More recently, we can look back to the 2008 financial crisis, the housing mortgage crisis that emerged. We see huge impact in businesses again, in terms of businesses that either closed, that decreased their operations, truncated. We see lots of consolidation in the 2008 recession where businesses closed branch plants in different areas and kind of put it all back into the main center. And then most recently, the COVID pandemic starting in 2020. And here we saw maybe a temporary short-term storm, but it had huge impacts, and the recovery from those impacts has been incredibly uneven. We've gone through all of these storms before. So the current tariff storm uncertainty, although maybe undesirable, isn't the first time we've been in this climate of uncertainty. Some of the common themes are dependence on global commodity markets tends to create more vulnerability. So the more we're connected to that, the more challenges we might encounter. Limited economic diversification in rural communities, the environmental vulnerability, and the outmigration of people were all common themes that took place in this area or during these economic storms. So we might think as we continue through this current tariff fiasco, we might anticipate some of these same themes depending on how the tariffs all kind of play out. Some lessons learned previous storms. I'll share these with you. I was involved with a group of folks that as the COVID pandemic started, we started to say, well, wait, let's not reinvent the wheel. The federal government, provincial governments were saying, let's create new programs, let's do things. And we said, well, wait, what did we learn from the last time we did this? And these were the 4 things that we pulled out. The first is that every rural community is going to experience this differently. Don't create one-size-fits-shop policies and programs because it will not work for everyone. Second is that industry support does not always benefit communities. And this was a critical lesson. So as we think about providing incentives, loans, whatever it might be to businesses, increasingly large-scale businesses are not necessarily connected to the place. They're international in scope, they're multinational in scope. And so the benefits that get accrued from that might not be in the community where the jobs actually are located. It might be in downtown Toronto, it might be in New York City, who knows where. So we can't assume that support for industry always necessarily supports the community. We also discovered, and this was particularly evident after the 2008 crisis here in Canada, that shovel-ready projects often dig deeper holes. So shovel-ready projects meaning in times of crisis, one of the things that governments often like to do at the senior level is to create a financial incentive to spend money to create jobs. So in the 2008-2010 recession that we saw, the federal government of Canada invested huge amounts of money into projects that were deemed to be shovel-ready. They could start within 90 days, they would employ people in the community, and they would have some sort of positive outcome. All of those ideas are really good. The dilemma is that those projects were rarely actually community priorities. The shovel-ready project that you could start in 90 days was something that was quick and easy, but it wasn't necessarily addressing long-term problems, long-term priorities in the community at all. The other dilemma with our shovel-ready approach to projects in a recession is that during recessions, we tend to spend large amounts of money at the public sector, and immediately after the recession, we see a decrease in public spending because we've exhausted perhaps more revenue or more spending than we would have in the pandemic or in the recession. So periods after recession, we tend to see a retraction of public spending. So that means the money that might have been available for infrastructure, for community development, was spent on shovel-ready projects. And most often those shovel-ready projects aren't addressing long-term priorities, long-term challenges in the community, but that's the only investment we've got maybe for the next 5 to 7, maybe 10 years. So these shovel-ready projects, although they create jobs, they get money moving, they do good things, they're not often the priorities or the long-term commitments that are needed in those communities. And finally, the lessons we learned from previous storms is that municipalities struggle in maintaining critical service infrastructure during recessions. Their financial and human resources get tapped incredibly beyond capacity often, and it creates huge challenges. It's also telling in that most of our communities already have infrastructure deficits before heading into an economic storm. And so we end up getting multiple layers of challenges for local governments to actually provide critical services during recessions. So all of that being said, I'll flag this for you. Back in 2020, when the pandemic started, the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, which is a nonprofit charity, got a bit frustrated that there was no information about how the pandemic was playing out in rural places. And government decisions were being made without any evidence of what's happening. And so a collection of researchers from across the country wrote 20 rural insight papers. They're 4 to 6 pages in length on various different themes: agriculture, land, looking at manufacturing, healthcare, gender. How are all of these impacted by the COVID and in rural communities? So these were a few reflections that came out from the first one that was written, looking at what should the governments be thinking about. One is that we discovered the federal and provincial governments rarely actually have boots on the ground in rural communities. They often don't have an office, they have no staff in these places, which makes it really difficult in terms of getting the voice of rural into government. How do we make sure that those priorities that are emerging, whether it be around supporting farmers, whether it be supporting small businesses, gets back into the machinery of government? Huge challenge. Access to financial capital was a huge issue for rural places. Most smaller communities may not have access to banks or credit unions in their community. And I remember a story of a lovely small business saying, to get her float, the change to break for exchange when people buy stuff, she has to drive 2 hours twice a week because that's the closest bank, just to get afloat to operate her business. And she was a small scale operator part-time, but it was something as simple as just access to a bank to get that money. It wasn't that she needed a loan of $100 million. She didn't need any change. It was just getting float for her business. She'd have to take time off of her work to be able to go drive for a couple of hours, a couple times a week, just to get change. We know that we have need for infrastructure investments. This came out loud and clear when we looked at the pandemic from 2020. We know this was one of the biggest lessons, and it's not something that's new, is that we don't have data for rural and northern places. So we are in this era of incredible data, incredible amounts of information, where you have an encouragement to do evidence-based decision-making, but we don't have data. It's not broken down in a useful way for rural places. And as a result, we are struggling to create evidence-based decisions when we don't actually have access to the data. Or when you look at Dufferin County and they say the data for Dufferin County is actually included in the GTA. You can use the Greater Toronto region as your data point, and you think the issues here on Centre Street are fundamentally different than on Yonge Street in downtown Toronto. But that's the only access to data in some instances. We know that we had burnout in voluntary organizations, community-based organizations, and we also know that the inequalities that were happening before the economic transition related to COVID were just further exposed, and further difficulties created for women, for Indigenous people, for newcomers, immigrants, and people of color. So all of this to say, these are really important lessons that we've learned from the past. Hopefully, as we move forward in these new transitions and their current climate, we can keep some of these ideas in our mind so that we don't repeat them. But I was going to ask you a question here around optimism. And this is important because Stats Canada just released their optimism survey from business data across rural Canada this week. So it's the same Slido number and all that if you're online and you can see it. But I'm wondering if you might just reflect on your optimism for the current economic climate here in Dufferin County or wherever you happen to be. With only 3 options, high, medium, and low. Just curious where people are in terms of that. Is this super optimism? Mediums for some in the room here. Lovely. So that's fantastic. I think I've got, oh, here's the business outlook. So this is data that was just released last week from Stats Canada. They asked every business these questions every 90 days. This includes farms, this includes small businesses, this includes large manufacturing companies. And I apologize that the colors don't come out maybe quite as well as I would like. Across the bottom is the year and the quarter, starting in 2022, in Q1, going to Q1 of 2025, which ended just in March. Across the vertical axis, we have the percent of people saying optimism, high, low, medium, and so forth. And at the very bottom in the dark bluish color is the very optimistic people. In the lighter beige brown color is the somewhat optimistic. And as we go up, the very light blue at the very top is unknown. And the darker, almost black color that's there, maybe dark brown, is the very pessimistic. What we can see are a few trends on this front. This is, and I should mention, this is only for rural communities here in Ontario. So this would only be small communities. What we can see here are a few things. In terms of the very optimistic, that rate hasn't really changed dramatically. It's stayed at about 20 to 25% across the board over the last 3 years. What's interesting, though, is the very pessimistic has fluctuated. At the top, the second color from the top, the dark brown or black, and we see that in 2024, Q4, a huge spike in pessimism. People not being optimistic about the business outlook for the next 12 years. What happened in Q4 of 2024? The elephant in the room, isn't it? This is the US presidential election, the lead up to the November election, and then statements being made by President-elect at the time, going forward around the idea of tariffs, what would they be, but without many details. What's interesting, though, is that over the past 3 months of 2025, that pessimism has dropped by about half of what we saw in the lead up to the what's that? It's Biden's fault. Yes, indeed. So we've got a bit of a drop in that. My suspicion, I have no data to prove this, but my suspicion is that in the Q4 of 2024, we would have seen lots of anticipation, lots of uncertainty. What would it actually mean? What percent? We started to see more certainty of that post-January, third week of January when the president was installed. And so we've had a bit more details around what that looks like. Unfortunately, those details tend to change on a very rapid pace that it makes for difficulty keeping up. I wanted to share a few more things that came out of the Business Outlook survey across rural Canada. Oh, sorry. So this is a question that's asked to every business around the obstacles they anticipate over the next 3 months. So what sort of obstacles they're going to anticipate. They don't describe what the obstacles are, but just in the next 3 months, what probability do you think you're going to encounter these obstacles? What's really important to recognize here is the dark colored bar is rural Canada, and the light grayish colored bar is urban Canada. Since 2022, rural businesses have faced more obstacles than urban. Every year, every quarter that we've seen. The obstacles are coming down. So back in 2022, we saw about 1/3 of businesses saying they anticipate facing obstacles. Now we're down around the 22% mark for businesses in rural communities facing these obstacles. This could be obstacles around finding jobs, finding workers, marketing products. It could be access to infrastructure. A whole bunch of different obstacles that are there. But it's important to recognize that almost a quarter of businesses right now anticipate encountering these obstacles over the next 3 months. This is the last question I'll share from this survey, and this is looking back over the past 3 months. That previous question was kind of forecasting what do they think they're going to encounter. This is a question asking businesses in both rural and urban Canada around supply chain obstacles. And supply chains, if this is not a concept that's familiar with you, this is essentially all the various processes that are involved from the start to the consumption of a product. So it might be grain that's being grown that goes to a refinery to be milled, to be sent to a bakery, to go to bread that goes to the grocery store that ends up in your household. In terms of these supply chain challenges, over the past 3 months, we see that since 2024, since the summer of last year, rural communities in the dark bar have experienced more challenges than urban businesses in supply chain management. We see this interesting just before in kind of it'd be October, November, December of 2024, actually lower in rural communities, around about 7-8% experiencing supply chain challenges. But when we start in this quarter, January, February, and March 2025, you see that number jumps to about 13% are experiencing supply chain challenges. In particular, anyone want to guess which industries are hit hardest by the supply chains? Auto is one, and the second is agriculture. It's either inputs, farm equipment, going across the border, being concerned about those input and supply costs. So the other pieces I was going to share about some of these statistics that are out that give us a context of what's happening. In terms of the employment rate in Ontario, this was released this week. Our employment rate is 7.5%. It's an increase from last month of 7.3%. And we're now actually the second highest unemployment rate in Canada, which has historically not been the case. The gross domestic product for this past year was at 1.2%. In previous years, coming out of the COVID pandemic, we saw numbers of 3%, 4%, and 5%. So it is a bit lower than the past number of years, but it's slightly lower than what they were predicting at 1.7%. And some data that came out from the Ontario Chambers of Commerce just this week is that 15% of businesses are confident in the province's economy. This is down from the previous time they did the survey of 25%. So the confidence in the economy by businesses is going down. And so we tend to have kind of increasing unemployment rates, decreasing gross domestic product, and decreasing confidence in the economy, which when we kind of package them all together is not a kind of a great scenario or a great landscape to be operating on. And this is a survey that I did with local governments across Ontario, and we're just sharing you the results from rural governments. And we asked them how prepared are they for long-term change in 4 different categories in terms of economic change, demographic change, climate change, and technological change. And this went out to every municipality, to both elected officials and to staff members to find out their perceptions. On the far side of the chart, on your left-hand side in the dark blue, is those folks that are extremely unprepared. The light blue that I've highlighted in red are those that are extremely prepared, very prepared. They're feeling good. The 2 concerns I have coming out of all of this are that only 6% of local governments in Ontario feel very prepared for economic change. This was before the pandemic. This was after the COVID pandemic, but before the tariffs when we collected this data. What's also a bit concerning from my perspective is that 55% of municipalities feel that they're either unprepared or unsure how to deal with economic change. So they know it's happening, but they're not sure how to participate in it, how to mitigate the negatives, how to promote the positives of these change, and they're struggling. That's over 1 in 2 communities in Ontario that are struggling with how to deal with economic change. And only 6% that are saying, we're ready for it, we've got the right apparatuses and resources. So this all brings us to this notion of vulnerability and opportunities. Curious to find out which sectors of the economy you think are maybe the most vulnerable here in Dufferin region, whether it's the county or the surrounding area. There's, I think, 15 choices there. I apologize for the wild number, but I'm just curious around which of these you might think are the most at risk or vulnerable for the current tariff environment. And if you want to shout out one that if you don't have a device, you're most welcome to do so. Those that are online, you can put them as well. Ag, yep. A few agriculture notes there. Manufacturing, the arts, recreation, tourism coming in. And we'll look at some projections from Desjardins and we'll impose them here in Dufferin County to see which ones are maybe the most likely to be impacted on this side of things. So clearly agriculture, manufacturing, and then we end up with arts, tourism, recreation, which would also probably include, that category include hotels, accommodation, I can't remember. But at the end of the day, some community-based services as well as agriculture and manufacturing. And my last question for you is just around barriers. What's the greatest barrier impacting economic development here in Dufferin at the moment? Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome to. I had my list of 3 that I thought would come up. We'll see if they come up. Yeah. Knowledge, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few coming in here. Yeah, just the cloud of, yeah. Labor, yep. Okay. So so these are topics that I thought would come up. I thought we would probably hear about labor and workforce development. I thought we would probably hear about housing. I thought we'd probably hear about knowledge, data, access to information so that people can make decisions, uncertainty given our current climate of just not knowing what's happening or how to plan. Even if you do have the evidence, tomorrow it might be fundamentally different at the end of the day. So the vulnerability here is really that susceptibility to shocks and stresses in the long term. How do we respond to it? And that's really what we want to think about as we're going through all of these transitions in the storm. And usually how we identify this vulnerability is through data, which ironically I said a few moments ago, we don't have good data, which is a bit of a perhaps calling card for local governments. If you can collect data, can use data that is locally already here, fantastic. It's also a process of engaging with local actors. What we find in rural communities is most businesses and farms will not come to a meeting to say that they are experiencing difficulty. These are issues that they usually deal with internal to the business or to the family farm. And so sometimes it's actually conversations that are needed with these actors to say, how are things going? Is there things that can be done to help what's happening in your world? Because they may not be coming to a public meeting. They may not be coming to share information in a survey that goes out by email. And so we need to be very proactive about that. And we need to monitor these trends over time. So the vulnerability comes from these sorts of things like lack of diversification. We've got the labor force challenges. This was particularly an issue for anyone that was in utilizing foreign labor during the pandemic. Foreign workers were not allowed into Canada for many months at the beginning. And we heard stories of many farmers saying they didn't plant crops because they didn't have the labor to do so. particularly asparagus, I think was one of the first hit industries in agriculture here in southwestern Ontario. But even after the pandemic, we still have issues around workforce development. I hear at least a story once a week around this.
Can I throw a wild card question out there? So I know we're talking about the Canadian context, but in the US with, and I hate to use this term, but the legal term, aliens being deported, what type of a hit or impact does that have on their agricultural industry?
Yeah, so I think the answer is no one knows exactly the extent of it at the moment, but we're hearing anecdotal stories both in agriculture and in construction. Those are the two big industries that have used migrant workers or workers that don't have legal rights in the country. And we've heard stories particularly of job sites that are vacant for certain days or for a certain week because there's a concern of immigration showing up at work sites. And so we hear of large disruptions that are taking place. My guess is we won't see the data on that probably for another 6 to 8 months, just because of how it's collected and distributed. But I'm anticipating we'll see significant challenges to that.
And is that something that could be advantageous for our ag industry?
Potentially. There is potentials there. My guess is those individuals that are in that situation in the US are not the same individuals that would be coming through the Canadian Ag Migratory Work Programs. But my suspicion is, and I was just doing some work in Mexico on this topic, is the Mexican workers are seeing more stability on the Canadian side of things than in the US side of things. So they see it as a better fit, even if it may not be a direct skill match, but they're saying in terms of stability for economics, for family, the legal, social aspects, that the Canadian system was maybe a bit more advantageous at this stage. Yeah.
Just wondered if certainly BSE was a big hit in livestock.
Yeah.
And if tariffs are applied to livestock, it would be pretty similar.
Yep.
Where were shut down with BSE.
Yep.
Yep. And when we look at some of the things that are added,
Yeah.
it was pretty desperate.
It was. My family are in that boat. I think it might even be worse than the BSE, because at the moment, the livestock industry is so interconnected to the United States. And so we see cows that are maybe being raised in Canada that might go across the border once for finishing in terms of feed, that might come back to an abattoir on the other side of the border, that then go back in terms of the market. And if you have to pay a tariff every time that crosses the border, in some regards, maybe a closed border is a bit easier to manage than trying to deal with this tariffs. But it's a huge issue. But there's many parallels to the BSE in the livestock industry. This is it. There was no market. Yeah. This is it. The markets were not there. My hope is that the BSE experience, speaking, learning from past storms, is that we learned about how to maybe pivot and look for alternative markets to get product out. And that we also looked at opportunities for more domestic. Now, I know after BSE, we had lots of conversations around abattoirs and creating local abattoirs so that we could increase capacity for slaughterhouse here in Canada. To my knowledge, that largely has not materialized. There are a few examples. I don't think so either. I think there's a few examples of incredibly maybe more boutique abattoirs that have been set up that are doing very small scale. But for the most part, I think we're actually worse off. I think many of the abattoirs have actually, particularly around succession planning, are no longer available. So as we've learned the lesson, but we don't necessarily have evidence that we've implemented it yet on that front. But yeah, the BSE crisis is another good parallel. Oh, I think, Jasmine, they might be passing you a mic.
Thank you, Gail. That was very nice of you.
Only because I was directed to.
Oh, yeah, my follow-up question to that is, so obviously the Automotives Association have gone forward and made advocacy efforts across the border for our ag industry, although there's very different, a lot of different players involved there. Are there any associations that you know of or advocacy efforts across the border that are advocating for the very thing that the automotive industry has been able to advocate for?
Yeah, I hear stories of it all the time, that there is advocacy, particularly from governors in the northern states who have the most direct contact usually to the Canadian exports, whether it be livestock, whether it be auto manufacturing, because for them, tariffs also are a huge impediment to their economic development. It causes issues for job creation, it causes issues around cost of living. All of these things get compounded. It's not just an issue on this side of the border. So we have been hearing from governors, from other advocates that are trying to promote this. Some of the agricultural organizations are saying, wait, this makes no sense because farm implement equipment is maybe produced on both sides of the border, so it's going to be more expensive for everybody involved. So there have been, whether that message is getting heard adequately and influencing change is something I'm not, have no information on, but it's something that probably more of those efforts aren't going to go to waste. Yeah. Maybe the last few things here I would mention is the political side of things. When we look to vulnerability in rural places and agricultural communities, we typically see an underrepresentation of rural and agriculture in our provincial and federal governments. It'll be interesting to see when the federal government cabinet is announced. I suspect it'll be very soon. Do we have representation from rural communities? Do we have representation from agricultural communities? Does our Minister of Agriculture have a connection to agriculture? In the previous government, we had a Minister of Rural Economic Development. Do we still have a Minister of Rural Economic Development? These are questions, but we do have an underrepresentation in the senior levels of government. And we also know that we have very limited power under globalization to influence things like another country's tariffs. We're at the mercy of other people doing that in the regulations that might emerge. So this is a lovely diagram that was generated a couple of weeks ago around the US value of Canadian exports to the United States. To actually all countries in the world, but you can see the dominant country there is the United States in terms of what we're sharing. What I was interested in is looking at where are these tariff hotspots. And there was a really interesting analysis done that said there are some communities in the country that are going to be more impacted than others. And that's just the nature of the unevenness of our geography and of our economies. And you may not be able to see it very well up on that screen. I do apologize if you're in the room. If you're online, you probably have a much better visual of it. What we see are those communities that are in the light blue color are communities that are deemed to be kind of less impacted by the tariffs of the United States. Then we get places like British Columbia, southern Vancouver in particular, the southern mainland, Sudbury, and some other communities across the country. Anyone know why these communities are less impacted by tariffs? Tariffs apply to all products regardless of where they're produced in Canada if they're going to the United States. But the analysis suggests that southern British Columbia is less impacted because their export market is actually closer tied to Southeast Asia. So they have a bit more diversity in terms of that. In terms of Sudbury, it was an interesting one on the list. Anyone know why Sudbury is not as impacted? Yeah, it's give it a say so people online can hear you.
Sorry, the nickel export market to Asia specifically.
That's right. So their primary export market is not the United States. They're susceptible to the United States tariffs and vulnerable, but it's not their only market that they're exporting to. But what's really interesting is what was redeemed in red there as a hotspot for tariff activity. We see Calgary, St. John, New Brunswick. That is based on petroleum. That's oil exports. We also see an interesting small town Quebec. Why was small town Quebec hit with this? As it be a hotbed, being highly susceptible and vulnerable to tariffs. It's not milk. It's a great guess though. It's another product, and that's aluminum. And this has been a much higher tariff than many other products. A lot of that production manufacturing taking place in the southern townships of Quebec. And the other hotspot for tariffs was southern Ontario, where we are today. And this was particularly related to two industries, manufacturing of autos and agriculture. So we're in one of these hotbeds right now of tariffs. So I wanted to share this image. This is from a nearby community where I used to work in Southern Ireland. And this kind of feels like what we're at the moment, where rural communities, businesses, farmers are that lovely person on the slide. And this tariff environment is that car coming at us, but no one really knows what direction it's coming. Is it going to hit you? Who knows what's happening? So I wanted to look at vulnerability here in Dufferin County to see where are things and what are we looking at. So I looked at this data that comes out of Desjardins, a large financial institution. They went through all of the major economic sectors and identified who was the most vulnerable, who was maybe medium risk, and who had the highest risk. So at the top of the list there are not going to come as any surprises. It's things like primary metals, food and beverage, chemical, machinery, aerospace, and so forth. In the middle category, I think they're yellow in color, are things like pulp and paper, wood, plastic, manufacturing, mining, and so forth. And then we get down into some other sectors where we probably have less vulnerability, things like retail, trade, accommodation, food, local construction, and so forth. So this was all very interesting, but I thought, what does this actually mean for Dufferin? So this is Dufferin County's employment by National North America Industry Classification System codes. There are 20 of them on the screen. The largest one here in the county is retail trade, followed very, very closely by manufacturing and construction. So if we impose the Desjardins risk and vulnerability, you'll see that the highest risk here is in manufacturing, in terms of some of the employers in this neck of the woods, followed by transportation, wholesale trade, and agriculture, being a medium vulnerability. These are very significant employers in the Dufferin County. The lowest risk of vulnerability are in these green dots you can see here: retail, trade, construction, accommodations, public administration, real estate, professional services, and so forth, as most of those are unlikely to be impacted directly by tariffs, but they will be indirectly impacted if people are losing jobs in manufacturing and agriculture, having less disposable income. They're going to support retail trade less, quite naturally. But this gives us a sense of where is this vulnerability here in the county. These other categories that are kind of in this shaded white-black are categories that are unlikely to be affected by tariffs, but the realities of the other sectors that are impacted, they might have a spin-off effect on these areas, whether it be around health and social care, public administration, education services, and so forth. If people don't have disposable income, they may not go on to post-secondary, they may not study here at the local campus, and so forth. So it means that Dufferin County is not immune to these tariffs and the discussions that are taking place, which I don't think anybody in the room thought before they came in. I looked at a whole bunch of data to try to find some good evidence, and my goodness, it was bloody difficult. So there's a wonderful resource called the Canadian Importers Database. It gives you a sense of who in every county is importing products. There are 4 listed here for Dufferin County. They're not surprised. They're very large employers here, all, I believe, in the polymer, PVC industries and related services. But these would all be deemed high vulnerability by Desjardins, because they are importing part of their product in from the United States or selling to the United States at the end of the day. But what this data doesn't describe is small-scale businesses that are operating here, agricultural operations that are operating here in the county. What this vulnerability could look like at the end of the day is things like businesses having disruptions to their supply chain, business closures, job losses. It could be relocation of businesses, young people leaving, decreased confidence in the community, all of these wonderful things that we don't want to see at the end of the day. So I was talking to a family member last night, and they said, what does this really mean? I said, we've got this chaos that's going on around us. We've got policy incoherence where we know what should happen, but we don't have policies that necessarily support what we think should be happening. We have this gigantic amount of uncertainty that it creates, but we've been here before. We've seen how this is happening. It's not necessarily a reason to hit the proverbial panic button, but it is a reason for some further attention. So a few things I'll maybe end with here. Lots of things that we can do to reduce this vulnerability around expanding our economic base, investing in infrastructure to ensure that we've got good broadband, good roads, good services that are available. We can find ways to perhaps mitigate or decrease out-migration. There's opportunities to engage in some sort of collaborative forums such as this and other activities that bring together economic actors to think about what might be able to be done. We know that quality of life is an incredible asset around economic development. We saw this in the COVID pandemic extensively, where urban residents moved to rural areas because of amenities, quality of life, access to green spaces, parks and recreation that they couldn't get in the urban environment. But if you didn't have high-speed internet, you probably didn't receive a whole lot of those urban residents coming out to the community. We need more data, and we need for more advocating for place-based and solutions that are important to rural. Here's some of the responses we've seen across the country. We've seen sector-based responses. This is largely talked about by our federal government, where they say we're going to create a program that will help any industry that's negatively impacted. The auto sector has been probably the one in the attention most, that if there are large job losses, we'll create a program that would support those. We've seen market diversification strategies where we're trying to find new and different ways to sell goods and services. The Homegrown initiative is out of OFA, an online market, not a marketplace, but an online platform that you can find locally grown agricultural products to connect people to those resources that are out there. And we also have a series of kind of various buy local campaigns that have been created. I stuck up here the one from Sudbury, which is in the northern part of Newfoundland, where they just simply did a buy local for the holiday. And it was a $6.2 million investment in a region of less than 50,000 people, just by encouraging people to shop locally to do so. They calculated the data. They had a passport that you got signed, and if you had so many passport stamps, you were entered into a draw on that front. It didn't cost anybody any additional money. It was just reinvesting the money locally. Huge impact for them. We've seen more recently promotion of domestic tourism. People aren't traveling necessarily to the United States, so how do we get those people that are still looking for their summer vacation, the getaway, to come out to rural places? And we've seen all sorts of collaborations that have been taking place, such as this, other counties that have been doing strategies and workforce planning and economic development strategy building. I wanted to share maybe one other one that we don't have as an option here in Ontario, but is in other places and has been incredibly important. And it's something called a community investment fund. These operate in about 6 provinces of Canada. I'll show you where they are. But what it is it's actually a secured investment that is created through the Securities Commission, where a community or a group of businesses can come together, or organizations for that matter, and they raise capital, financial capital, to then reinvest in economic development activities. The aim is really to create financial capital for local communities. They're not relying on downtown Bay Street to support their initiatives. They can find ways to do this in their communities. So Nova Scotia was the first province to create these back in 1999. We see them in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Manitoba, BC, and Alberta. But what they do is if you actually invest your money into the community investment fund, if you keep it there for a certain number of years, you receive a tax incentive. Your investment is protected under the Insurance Corporation's investments, so no different than any other investment that you make. If you keep it in Nova Scotia for a minimum of 5 years, in addition to the value that you've invested, you'll get a tax credit of 35% of the value. In addition, if the investment that you've made generates a dividend, the businesses that they use the money for create a dividend, you would get that dividend as well on your investment. Other provinces, I think it's in New Brunswick, it's 50% tax incentive. So if you put in $1,000, you keep it there for 4 years, the province guarantees you a 50% rebate. That's a pretty decent investment on that side of things. What we've seen these investment funds used is predominantly in rural economic development and agricultural development. We've seen examples where communities have bid on large contracts for food supplies to hospitals, schools, jails, and other institutions run by government, and said, why are we buying vegetables from the United States when we produce them all here locally? But often these institutions say, well, you need to produce vegetables 12 months of the year. Farms are only doing it maybe 4 to 8 months. So we've seen initiatives where they've started a community investment fund to raise the capital to build refrigerated storage facilities in different parts of the region so that they can store vegetables, so they are available for hospitals 12 months of the year and be able to bid and receive that contract from the government. That in turn, if it's generating revenue, brings money back into those investors. These programs are also all registered through the Securities Commission, so it means that you don't actually have to put in new investments. You could ask your business or your bank or your financial institution that as part of your RRSP, you'd like part of that invested in a community investment fund. Just reprofiling your existing investment into a new area. These have huge potential for community economic development, rural development, and agricultural development. Unfortunately, Ontario does not have this system or policy in place or program in place, but is something that other provinces have been very successful at doing. Here's a few examples of what's going on in those places, whether it's around wind energy, whether it's around coffee shops, whether it is agriculture, farm works, Nova Scotia. There's all sorts of different activities that can be supported through this. So here's my takeaway message. Place matters. Economic transitions are not new to rural economies. Senior levels of government will not save rural economies. We've learned this through all of our past economic storms. And I'm not sure we want senior levels of government to save rural communities. we're not wanting them to ride in on the horse to save rural communities. I think we've got good suggestions, good ideas in local, and often we need senior levels of government to get out of the way and support what's happening locally. But we know that sitting back and waiting for Ottawa or for Queen's Park to save a community's economy, you're going to be waiting a long time. We also know that data is critical to understanding what's happening, and we don't have good senses of that. This is the last thing I'll share is a lovely comment that came from a local community elected official back in COVID-19, who said, you know, in all of this transition, all of this storm that we're going, we can't waste a good downturn. This is an opportunity to actually take stock, reinvest, figure out where we want to be, and sometimes it's also about figuring out where we don't want to be and how to start laying the foundation for doing that. And so this mayor said to me, you know, downturn, absolutely negative, we don't want to see it, but if we are going to see it, let's make hay out of it. Let's make sure we don't waste this opportunity to figure out and build something more sustainable and more productive. So I'll leave it there. This slide deck I'll put online on that webpage. You feel free to reach out at any time on that side of things if I can answer questions, but happy to answer any questions that people may have at the moment if they're easy. And if not, we'll pass them over to Luke if they're really difficult. Perfect.
Okay, so I guess I'll start off, but before I start off, for the folks online, you can raise your hand and we'll pay attention to the screen. Okay, so a number of things were mentioned. I like the earlier discussion around like collaboration with like different organizations, industry groups across state lines. How exactly do we do that? Because I think that maybe ties into the whole interprovincial trade conversation, and perhaps how we move that forward is different industry groups banding together and yeah.
Yeah, I think there's two different things that come to my mind immediately. The first is there's probably groups that are well positioned to do that, that have some of those connections already. So it's not about starting from square one. So it's how to harness those groups that are maybe involved with it or maybe having a much shorter on-ramp to becoming involved with it. That's one. The second, though, I think there's a role for local economic development practitioners in local governments to think about how do we create the forums for people to actually come together to have these conversations. And it may be that the local governments aren't actually leading the advocacy role to other organizations or other places, but they're actually facilitating the conversation of bringing people to the same table to say, you know, what is the issue? What is the message we want to be sending? But maybe the message carrier is actually industry associations, maybe it is agricultural organizations. But too often I find in rural communities, even though the space and the geography is very small, a lot of these actors don't actually talk to each other. They're busy doing what they're doing. And so they've not had an opportunity to sit down to think about, you know, is the issue that I'm impacted, is it the same as the manufacturer 3 blocks down the road is impacted by? Is it the same thing that farmers are impacted by? And so we tend to have very narrow vision of how we do that. And I think there's a real role in just facilitating conversation, bringing people to the table, thinking about how to package that messaging to advocate outwards. But I think there are groups that are actively doing this or could be doing this with some encouragement. And my guess is sometimes the voice is much better heard when it comes from people on the front line as opposed to somebody that is in government or in a different sector. You know, it's much greater to hear from the impact from farmers if we're talking about agricultural product, but it's voices of farmers that are sharing that, not a third party that's presenting on their behalf. I think there's a question online.
Hi, it's Warden Horner here. Ryan, thank you for your presentation today. Yesterday, I was fortunate enough to attend the Shelburne Economic Development Business Seminar. And, you know, one of the things that I find, you're talking about bringing groups together who can bring that messaging a little wider than what we can individually. One of the things that we heard from the economist, the Royal Bank economist yesterday, was that was a message of hope that we shouldn't be super depressed, because she had all kinds of data showing that Canada is going to be a little more resilient than our neighbor to the US when it comes to the tariff issue. And, you know, that's what I think the value of meeting with groups like this one today, like the one I was at yesterday, is that I can tend to get myself a bit down over it all by listening to some of the social media postings and the media about, you know, oh my God, the sky is falling. I think we need your messages of hope and positivity because that's what'll carry us through more than anything else. That's what will build a resilient individual and therefore a resilient economy. So thank you for some of your messages today.
Yeah, those are great comments. I think the message of hope has gotten lost in a lot of our media and just the social media. You just get barraged by it. But there's two pieces that come across as you were sharing that story from the RBC economist. One is I've been inspired by the reallocation of people's travel. People have been abandoning or discontinuing vacation travel or unnecessary travel to the United States, but they're not just not traveling. People are looking proactively for other places to do their travel. And so I was listening to some wonderful stories on the CBC radio, you know, groups over in Algonquin that are saying they're seeing high spikes in the number of requests for accommodations and looking for holidays because people aren't going to other locations on that front. And I think the other one that's been quite interesting that often offers a lot of messages of hope is the consumers wanting to buy local now, that maybe didn't realize there was opportunities to buy local. They didn't realize the diversity of what was being produced in their own community, that are now saying, well, why am I buying this product from a large multinational company when I could buy that product in my neighborhood from people that I know and want to support? But there's been a disconnect for many consumers around how do we do that? Where do we get local products? And I think there's been some good campaigns around bringing awareness to what's being grown and produced in areas, but also just in services as well, in terms of things like simple as printing services. You know, how do we support local? How do we support these industries and these actors that are in our own backyard that maybe we forgot were there, never knew were there? But yeah, that message of hope is definitely needed and more of it. And I think there's also some really cool success stories that are coming out of this tariff discussions and landscapes of businesses that maybe are changing their activities. And that's something I'm really hopeful we'll start to hear more of over the coming months, is not just, you know, the negative, you know, 10% tariff, 25% tariff, meetings didn't go well, but rather hearing stories of how businesses and farmers and other actors have actually changed their day-to-day practices to do something that is more effective, more efficient, more better, whatever that better might look like for them.
Do I have to press one? Okay. I just had a thought. When you were talking about the data and how which is true, there is very little data. Oftentimes it's connected to a larger community like Guelph or the city, Toronto. Is there an opportunity to potentially partner with Guelph University to create a database that's specific to, let's say we start with Dufferin County, because each ECDEV community, or we all collect data, local data, but it might not necessarily all be in one single place.
Yeah, I think there's huge potential for that. I think there's huge potential, maybe two sides of that coin. One is the amount of data. I'm always surprised that communities don't realize how much data they generate. I've been in a couple meetings over the last few months where people say, oh, we have no data, we don't collect any data. I say, what about all of your tax records? What about all of your water, your service delivery data? They say, oh yeah, we've got all of that, but it's not being thought of as data. Or sometimes people say, well, it's not legitimate data because it didn't come from Stats Canada, or it didn't come from the government of Ontario. And so there's a huge amount of data that communities already have that they probably aren't using well. They use it for the day-to-day purposes, but aren't maybe necessarily using it for some medium or long-term planning. But the other side of that coin is I think there are rules for academic institutions to say, how can we help out in terms of either helping to gather, to collate, to analyze, but also there's opportunities to access data that maybe communities don't have access to, but universities do. And so there might be ways that in Stats Canada data, a university can say to the government, can we get that organized differently? Can we do a special run of that data focused on a geography that makes sense or a sector for that community? And there's ways to do that on that front. Yeah. There's also a couple of other groups I was going to mention that have data that I believe most municipalities in Ontario have access to through, I believe it might be AMO, and that's the Community Data Program. And they're a national organization that's coordinated by the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, and they buy special runs of data on behalf of organizations. And those member organizations then can tap into it and access it. And universities are one of those, so if AMO isn't the right entryway in, I'm sure a university can help facilitate that so that communities can get access to different data that's not publicly available. Because at the end of the day, our publicly available data is only a tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of data that's held by those organizations that just isn't publicly released. Sometimes it's around confidentiality, but sometimes it's just they've told a story that they wanted to tell with the data, and they just got more data coming in, so they've moved on to other data sets, and they're there and available, and they're publicly owned, so we need to use them. But yeah, there's huge potentials.
So on the conversation of data, County Council actually gave us direction to acquire some primary data. And Ryan, we talked about that a few months ago,
Yeah.
but we are now in the process of finalizing an agreement with a consultant to basically help us collect that data, going door to door to farmers, manufacturers in town, understanding their operations and some of the things that they want to do going forward, and of course utilizing that data for some long-term strategic planning. But if there is no question right now, I actually have a question on that sort of long-term thinking, because you talked about the challenges of bringing urban sort of mindset or strategies to rural strategies. Can you expand a little bit on that? Because one of the things that we do want to do with this primary data is an investment attraction strategy.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to recognize that rural and urban are interconnected. It's not a one-directional connection. They're very much interconnected. We rarely see that interconnection. We usually hear kind of that ATM-like metaphor of coming out to rural, going back to the city. But incredibly, rural and urban are intricately related and interwoven. I remember, I'll leave the community nameless for their own protection, but I remember speaking at a community in Ontario where I asked a room of urban development practitioners, how many here need rural for their future? And maybe 10% of people put their hand up. The other 90 said, no, for the most part, we can do what we need to do. And my second question was, where did their water source come from? And all of a sudden, they realized they have no municipal water source inside the urban boundary. All of their municipal water comes from the surrounding rural area, which was another opportunity to put the question back out to people, how many people needed rural for their economic livelihood? And it was incredible how that number went from 10% to 100%. But it's these relationships between urban and rural that we often don't see and we forget about, but they're incredibly necessary and useful. The other one I'll share as a story was Via Rail. Via Rail transports people on trains predominantly between cities. And I remember being invited to speak at one of their events and said, you realize that you are a rural company. If rural says you cannot transport through their space, your business model is incredibly vulnerable. If a municipality says there's no trains allowed at all, or trains can only transport through on certain hours, the entire business model of that company is changed. But their thinking of the company is very much an urban company, moving people from Toronto to Montreal to Ottawa to London and so forth. And so I think part of it is understanding that nuanced relationship that does already exist. Part of it's also exploring what could that be? Because in many instances, it's a contested relationship between urban and rural. Sometimes there's just no relationship. But part of it is, how do we figure out how we can work together? Where are there common priorities that can be explored? And where perhaps there are things that are not common priorities that truly need to be done independently. But at the end of the day, I think we'd be incredibly remiss if we try to build strategies that are just isolated and kind of siloed and not being engaging these urban partners along the way, because they're incredibly intricate to the economies. Oh, microphone.
I just want to get the wording of my question correctly.
While you're looking for your wording, Luke, I was just going to show people online in the room. This is the community data program. that does that special order of Stats Canada data. I believe the website is just communitydata.ca. I'm sorry, there's a bar that's right on top of mine, so I can't see it right at the top, but I think it says communitydata.ca. Wonderful initiative. It's a nonprofit that charges a small amount of money for a membership fee on behalf of a large consortium that then purchases data, special runs of data that aren't available publicly. And if the municipality isn't a partner, I bet you there's a handful of other partners here in the neighborhood that do have access to it, either through associations, through other groups on that front.
So the wording I was looking for there was how do communities attract data collection within their regions if there's lack of capacity within their resources? How do we get communities to see the value within data collection? I know we were speaking on it earlier, but what do we do to focus and narrow down that attraction of data and the power of knowledge that there is within rural?
Yeah, it's a good question. My suspicion, as someone who likes data, is it's not shared by everybody. Most people don't think about data on a regular basis on that side of things. So the question becomes, how is it important for their future? Or how does it impact their future? And I think that's the argument that needs to be made, is around we're collecting information not for the sake of being invasive, we're not collecting it for the sake of just doing it, but rather that it directly contributes to the future, to decision making. And so I think if we can really articulate how it's going to be used and how it benefits different people, I think there's a much easier way to collect it. It's time intensive, there's a cost to collecting data of that nature. But there's ways to be creative around that, whether it's partnering with academic institutions that might be able to help do some collection or do some analysis, whether it's partnering with neighboring communities. There's lots of various different ways that they can be explored. But I think at the core of it is if people don't see it as valuable, people aren't going to participate. Because everyone's busy, everyone's got lots of things they could do, but how do we make it seem important and valuable to their activities?
I think on the data front, arguing about the uniqueness of the data's origin is really what gets you to a place of getting people on side. Speaking to, I mean, you said it in your presentation, a lot of the data that we have that's particular to Dufferin County is actually lumped in with the GTA. And so that's not granular in nature to Dufferin County and doesn't provide us with enough insight as to where we need to go and how we need to do it. So I think speaking to the uniqueness of the actual origin of the data is where we can get people on side.
Yeah, and I think there's also a role that's emerged over the last number of years around misinformation and how to combat that misinformation that might be out there, or even perceptions around, how many people are employed in manufacturing. We often think that maybe it's a much lower. How many people are involved in farm practices, farming, and what types of farming? We've over the years have a bit of a disconnect between our own experiences in that. And so we sometimes have misinformation, we have misunderstandings. Sometimes it's innocent, it's not intentional or malice, but sometimes we actually have misinformation that's out there that serves as a disservice to what we're trying to do. Yeah, but knowing the source, knowing where it's come from, ensuring that it's representative of the community, really quite critical. Yeah.
Just additional thought on that. So as we're about to embark on this primary data collection effort, is there a way to overcome some of the barriers to people maybe being hesitant to divulge in information, especially in a rural context?
Yeah, there's always concerns about this in a rural community because it's smaller size of people. But I think there's two things that come to my mind. One is when we talk about data, it's not always about collecting new data. It's just using existing data that's already out there that we just maybe have never thought about using, or we've never asked anybody if they have this information. And oftentimes groups have collected it because they need it for taxes or they need it for import-export permits. They've got it all captured, but they've never shared it or never thought about it as a source of information. So sometimes it's actually just shaking the metaphorical tree to see what data actually exists. It may not need to have anybody collect anything new. We might have everything we need already. And this is where those conversations around partnerships become critical, because you can start to ask people, the various manufacturing groups, the groups like OFA and other, what data do you already have? Do you have it available for the county? Can we share some of that? And sometimes we can't share data because of privacy concerns, but my general sense is most rural organizations will say, we can't share it with you, but if you tell us what you need, we could maybe do a quick analysis and send you an output or a summary of what that means so that we can maintain that confidentiality. And at the end of the day, that's phenomenal. on that front. So I think part of it is we don't necessarily need to collect new data. Let's use the data we've got, be creative around it. There are going to be situations where we don't have data, and that's going to be around how do we figure out how to collect that data. And it might be that we need to do some surveys, or we need to buy some data that exists already. People just need to figure out what is that data, what's the value of it. And usually as people see the value and the purpose of it, they're happy to contribute or be part of that. The other piece, though, is that there's also a social contract, I would call it, that comes from data collection, is that one needs to actually return to people that have provided data to tell them how it's being used. Because otherwise people say, I've sent in some data, I've shared my data, I saw nothing out of it. Nothing came from it, so I'm not going to do it again. And so there's an obligation, a social contract that as one collects information, there's a responsibility to share things back to those users, which also I think starts to help out in terms of the argument of why more people would want to contribute information into that, businesses, organizations, and so forth. So it's a very long-winded answer to say, I think we've got lots of data already, and I think to get new data, it's around getting a commitment and seeing why it's valuable and being able to demonstrate how it's being used at the end of the day. And my goodness.
Could you just repeat your statistic that you made at the beginning about the 17% and the 30%? I love that line.
Yeah,
I would like to use it.
Yeah, so 6 million Canadians live in rural communities, which is about 17% of the population. The economic, the gross domestic product that's generated in rural communities, the value of all the goods and services produced is 30%. So 17% of the population generates 30% of Canada's gross domestic product. And that's something I would love to see splashed on the front page of the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, because it's not well known. And my guess, I have a colleague that's been running the data, but my guess is that, I don't remember the exact detail, but it's something around 40% of all the stocks traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange are actually rural products. So even though we think of the stock exchange as being this incredibly urban environment, it's actually trading rural commodities.
So we could quote that in our local paper.
I can send you the data, absolutely. The 17% is Stats Canada, and the federal government's Rural Economic Development Office created their report saying 30% roughly of that. So yeah, it can be cited. I can send you the details. Yeah, but I think it's an incredible statistic that we don't recognize very often. Yeah, 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 almost double. I'm sure some of my colleagues in the city would be shocked to hear that.
There's like 2 of us here.
Senior governments and all the rest, yes, yeah, yeah. But I think this is another important part of these transitions is the stories. We don't tell the stories very well. We often hear all of the negatives, and I think the warden mentioned this. We hear all these negatives. It can be incredibly depressing. It can be incredibly frustrating to get the energy to think about doing something different. But there's also incredible stories that are coming out of new businesses that are opening, businesses that are changing, products that have been changed, how they're being used, new markets that are being explored. Small things like I've seen a few local counties saying they're buying pencils and paper now locally. And they've created policies that say, we'll buy local. We recognize it might still be a little more expensive than buying it through an online supplier, but as long as it's within 10% or whatever their magic numbers, we'll buy local because it has an impact on local people, local economy, local jobs. And so there's all sorts of these stories that unfortunately aren't being told. And part of it is a byproduct that most rural places don't have a local newspaper anymore. Newspaper industry has been consolidated. Many have disappeared. What is left is often still urban generated stories that get published in small papers. So we have to figure out ways to tell these stories of success. Also to tell the stories of things that didn't work well. Because if it didn't work well here, it may not work well in another community. And why not learn from other places as opposed to everybody doing the same thing over and over again and not getting any success. So the stories are, I think, huge.
So question for you, given the economic output of ag and rural communities, and now given the growing sort of conversation around affordable, attainable housing with a big pressure from the provincial government for, essentially build faster and build more, and urban urban boundaries not having the capacity or land to do so, and sprawl happening into our rural communities. How do we balance that? I know you don't have a magic sort of
Yes.
formula, but how would you sort of tackle that?
Yeah, I think this is a challenge that's going to be increasing the tensions of it. So this tension of increased need for housing, I think everyone recognizes we need more housing. That's not an issue. I think the issue is around how do we do it sustainably and what do we prioritize in building housing? And those are conversations that don't often take place, partly because the timeline that's been tagged to build more houses more quickly is so quick that we can't have these conversations. These conversations are also incredibly sensitive. There's all sorts of factors at play that need to be figured out. So I think part of it is trying to be proactive in figuring out, where is opportunity for new housing. This doesn't work well though when we see MZOs, that we might have all of these well-designed community initiatives, and at the end of the day, a ministerial zoning order comes down, and you're back to square one, and things are not being done as it is being advocated by the community, which makes it incredibly frustrating for both staff, for community members, for developers, when the rules of the game just keep changing. And so I think there's a lot of parallels to the tariff chaos that's kind of been ensued. We've got this landscape that is incredibly changing quickly in terms of housing, in terms of the regulations, the expectations, development charges. We've got all sorts of things that have changed in the last 4 years. So I don't have a silver bullet. I think it involves a lot of conversation around what's the priority, because once agricultural land, if it goes being used for residential, it's not going back to agricultural land. So we're not making some of these decisions with long-term thought behind them, which is a bit unnerving on that side of things. So I think it's around local priorities, figuring out how to do this, and then trying to move forward, but knowing that local municipalities are creatures of the province. The province ultimately has the ability to change local decisions, override them, that may not be seen in the best interest of local people, which is incredibly frustrating. So I think I've not answered your question at all. I do apologize. I think there are some interesting stories on this around Ontario, around how some communities have been dealing with this, some that have worked really well, some that have not worked well. And so it might be an opportunity when we think about organizations like Roma or other EDCO, thinking about trying to advocate for these stories to be part of the conference agendas, part of professional development training opportunities, where we can say, this is what community X did, it worked really well. Others can kind of say, that might work in my community, I could customize that. Other places might say, this did not work well. We had a great strategy and it all came for naught because of X, Y, and Z. And those are really important lessons to learn from others so that other communities don't have to repeat that same lesson. But I don't think it's going to get easier. I think it's going to get more difficult. Good luck. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Ryan, there's a question online. It's going back to the rule 17% population versus the GDP 30%. Is the Canadian number similar to the Ontario numbers? And what percent of the rural GDP is agriculture?
So great questions. I don't have the data right in front of me for either, unfortunately, but I can take a look and send that over to yourself, Jasmine. I think in terms of Ontario, it's very similar to the national average. So question number one. Question number two, in terms of what percent of rural GDP is agriculture, I don't know off the top of my head. And I'm not even going to wager a guess, but I can take a look for that and send it along. If the person can either put their email address in the chat box, or if you've got their email address, we'll get them that information. Unless anyone in the room knows what percent of our GDP is agriculture related. Anybody have that number just at the back of their hand? So my quick Google search from Stats Canada, from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, indicates that last year agriculture employed 2.3 million people, 1 in 9 jobs, generated $150 billion, which was approximately 7% of Canada's gross domestic product. So that's not of the rural GDP, but that's of all of Canada. But I can take a look for the rural GDP number on that front. Good Google sometimes. Works well. Sorry.
What are your thoughts on using a community improvement plan to help support ag?
Good question. So are everyone familiar with the community improvement plans? We should maybe start there.
No, start at the basis.
I was going to ask you to start.
No, I'm ready to take it.
So community improvement plans are an option that's provided to municipalities under the active legislation. It's not something that not all communities operate them, but it is an option that communities can set forward if their councils decide to do so. In doing so, they have to set up a set of parameters of what they're trying to achieve and for what region that plan will take place in. I would say most community improvement plans are not related to agriculture. Most are typically related to Main Street revitalization, issues around beautification, updating buildings for particular accessibility, maybe converting second floor spaces into housing with a first floor that is maybe commercial or retail. We also see some that are around tourism and recreation. Those are probably the most common uses, or else I should say business downtown revitalization, bringing businesses back into the downtown, getting spaces ready for that. So it's not the most commonly used for agriculture. There are potentials that it could be used. I'm just trying to think of what's actually in the active legislation around what has to happen. There typically are small grants that are provided to a business operator that might be painting, refurbishing a space. And so if it could fit, agricultural purposes could fit under that, I suspect there's a potential. Does Dufferin have one?
So we are looking into creating one. So that was the reason for my question. But you're right, they are mainly used for Main Street revitalization or downtown revitalization of small commercial uses. Potential for us here in Dufferin County, I think, speaking to your earlier point on processing and arbitrars and that sort of nature, I mean, that could be something of a larger scale project that could potentially fall under a community improvement plan with the likes of a TIG, a tax increment grant that could be granted out to our ag industry. That's sort of on the larger scale of things. But I mean, I think
would be another potential. Sorry, I'm just brainstorming, but yeah, on-farm diversification could be another one.
Yeah.
Whether it's market stands, whether it's using part of the farm for hosting events or activities or other festivals, whatever it might be, could be potentials there as well.
Yeah, so just going back to your sort of original point of the urban rural fringe and how do we sort of learn from urban sort of strategies that have worked, that we could take a rural spin on it. It could be the community improvement plan, and that could be an option for us to be able to help support our ag industry, especially in times of sort of uncertainty.
I've made myself a note to look through some community improvement plans to see how many have agricultural components to them. I'll share it back with you. Yeah, I don't have all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but students in the economic development course.
I know Wellington does. I believe Peterborough County.
I was going to say Norfolk or Haldeman.
Yeah. So there's some out there that are scattered, but you're right, it is predominantly urban. But yeah, if we can take a rural spin on it,
why not?
It could be something.
Yeah.
Just to have a comment. I think what we all have commented on in common is food, and we all eat it, and some of us produce it and would like to sell it.
Yeah.
And I find your comments about, well, I say it's in crisis when we make change. When things are good, nobody wants to change it, right? But when there's a crisis, everybody thinks we should change something. And certainly this is the third wave that maybe not that I've been involved with, right? The first wave was certainly BSE. Everybody wanted to buy local because they thought it was safer. And the second wave was COVID, and this may be the third wave. And somehow we need to facilitate that because there certainly is desire from the buying public to buy more local. And it's easy to say, but it's rather difficult to do, especially on the red meat side, meat side. And to be able to sustain that demand when there's not crisis, that's bigger issue I feel is that, during BSE it was crazy, and even during COVID, once those events were over, everybody just went back to the supermarket and bought what they bought before, and they didn't know where it came from, right? So how do we, if we're going to invest in that, how do we sustain that after crisis is over.
Yeah. Ironically, my head said, just sustain the crisis.
Yeah, that'd be
But
great.
that's not the answer by any means. Please don't walk away with that idea. But I think there's some lessons to be learned, because you're right, keeping attention on buy local is, when we have crisis, it's huge. I know community-supported agriculture, farm stands, the livestock industry had huge benefits during BSE when people turned because they said, I know James, I know Sally, I trust them. I have no issue of confidence with that supply. Unfortunately, you're right, as those crises have disappeared, people have gone back to, perhaps it's convenience, perhaps it's price, perhaps it's just habit, all sorts of factors that play into that. And keeping the crisis is not the way to sustain that by any stretch of the imagination. I don't have a good answer to it, but I think there are good answers out there. I think particularly of places like Ireland and the United Kingdom, who had a fourth wave with foot and mouth, in addition to BSE and ...
Or foot and mouth here.
No, we don't want that. But I think they did some really interesting activities around marketing. And that marketing really hit home for consumers. So part of it was labeling of products in terms of some geographical where this came from, beyond simply Canada or Ontario, but it was saying, this came from this county. And it gave people just an increased sense of confidence in it. I think there's also some opportunities to learn from them around how they did some collaborative marketing and selling of those services, so that it wasn't just one-on-one necessarily, but there's maybe an opportunity for farm organizations that maybe could help to collaborate and to coordinate. So it took some of that responsibility off of individual farmers. I remember hearing from farmers saying that they were overwhelmed during the crisis. Their phone kept ringing saying, can I come and buy, ground beef right now? And people are saying, well, no, I'm out in the fields. Can you come tonight? And they say, oh, no, I can't come tonight. And so there's that missed market. So how do we create those opportunities so that it's not a demand on a farmer that they have to be at the beck and call of the consumer to answer but there's a way that the consumer can still get that. I think there's also a lesson to be learned from Europe in getting local foods into large-scale grocery stores, and doing so in a sustainable manner that is beneficial to both the superstore or the large market and the farmer. And that's something that I don't think we've done well here in Canada, and in a sustained method. Others might have experiences that are maybe to the contrary, happy to hear that, but we haven't figured that out yet, how to kind of enter that market where people maybe go to outside of the crisis to buy their products, so that they could, if it's a convenience factor, if it's whatever it is, those local products are available for them. Yeah. Yeah, liquor store does this. Yep, same concept. They're selling products. And I know there's challenges in that system in terms of volume and all sorts of things, but you're right. There are lots of experiences of us doing this where we've given space to local producers in existing stores. So how do we figure out how to do that in a meaningful manner that isn't that gives everyone benefit?
And I do want to encourage us to continue to do that. When this last crisis, we started labeling Canada in our grocery stores, in the big stores. Yeah. That is so awesome. I hope we continue to do that, and I hope our consumers continue to look for those labels, and somehow we need to get that message and have that carried on, that how important that is for the local producers. To have that recognition that they're buying something from Canada, from Ontario, from Dufferin County, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So
I want to share with everyone a really cool initiative that came out of Newfoundland. And I've not seen this done anywhere else very well, so I always like to give them credit for this. This is a group called Fogo Shorefast Foundation. They created an economic nutrition label on their products. And for every product that they sell, it indicates where the money goes to. Does it stay on the island in Fogo? Does it go somewhere else in Newfoundland? Does the revenue go to somewhere outside of Canada or internationally? And where does that money actually go? Is it wages? Is it infrastructure? Is it transportation? And this was a really cool initiative that brought a lot of attention, just as you were saying. Not only is it made in Canada, but it actually started to say, how local was this? Was this benefiting British Columbia? Was this benefiting somewhere else? But this is a really interesting initiative that they've done. Now, their products are things, quilts, arts and crafts, and so forth, but it's something that could easily be adapted to other industries, other products. But it was a really interesting community-based recognition of accounting, where this is going. And I think they were challenged to say, how is their profits, where are they going? And this was their outcome. Yeah, it'd be lovely to see something similar like that. Yeah. Oh, perfect.
On the meat front, there are some interesting things that are being done through social enterprise
Yeah.
models. So there is a way, I personally buy my meat online, and it comes as a box, but it's from farmers all across Ontario. I think there's even some meats are coming from as far away as British Columbia, but you basically order it online.
Sure.
It comes in a box, but it is meant to be all local. And I think it's called Local Food is the company that I'm using,
Great.
but there is opportunities, I think, potentially to create more of those sort of options for consumers, so that they don't necessarily, if they can't find it in a grocery store, they can at least find it online.
Yeah, and that's kind of a one-stop shop.
Yeah,
You go one place and you've got
you can
options
buy
for-
chicken and beef and lamb and just about anything you like.
Yeah, indeed.
But it technically is usually also organic oftentimes, or
Sure.
grain-fed and that sort of thing. But
Yeah, and you can probably search it for
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we've got examples of how to do it. It's a lot of work. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but the question becomes, is there a way to support that lot of work so that no one has to bear the responsibility of all of it? We did some work with some of the cooperative agricultural cooperatives who started looking at, they'd often hire people for seasons, and they need a forklift operator for 4 months, but then they don't need them for the other 8 months. And that person that has the forklift certificate doesn't want to wait around for 8 months and not be employed. They want to find a job that keeps them employed year round. And so agricultural cooperatives started to say to each other, well, why don't we start to share human resource data? Maybe we need a forklift operator for 4 months on a different time of the year. And between 2 or 3 agricultural operators, they say, actually, we can keep that person busy the entire year, even though they might work for 2 or 3 different agricultural cooperatives over the year. But how can we start to think about this creatively? Because that person will now stay in the community, they'll have their family in the community. But if they didn't, they would constantly be on that springboard of trying to attract a new person for 4 months to do that task. But we've got examples, but yeah, lots to be learned. But it does take time, it does take some energy, but hopefully we can find ways to do that. Oh, sorry.
I was trying to wait to the end because this is more of a comment.
Oh, lovely.
I was trying to wait to the end because this is more of a comment, and I have a lot of municipal people in the room. I think you gave me a bit of a segue when you spoke about thoughtful rural planning. I was contacted this morning by one of your former colleagues, Dr. Wayne Caldwell, contacted me, and of course, you know about rural planning, but a lot of planners actually, unless they go through the Guelph program, they have no knowledge of rural planning. Dr. Caldwell is going to teach a Ontario Professional Planners Institute course on June the 3rd that is eligible for their continuing education credits. So I think it would be great if we could get some good uptake from Dufferin County to get down to that program. It's designed for planners, and they would learn from the best.
I think planners and economic development practitioners, not just planners, but kind of that broader spectrum, are more than welcome to be there. And I think it might also be available online, or is it just in person? I can't remember. I remember Wayne sent me, I think I got it yesterday. This morning.
Yeah, there will be one available online, I think, in the fall. But of course, in person is better, and I'd like Dufferin to get in first.
Yeah, there you go. And so there's all these sorts of opportunities for training that we should take advantage of on that. And this is a good one to reference. Yeah, that's it on that side of things. Any other questions before I turn the podium over? Perfect.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was awesome. I have 2 pages of notes here, so that's great. No, that's great. Just quick announcement before everyone hops off. I know we are at time. Like Raj mentioned at the beginning, this is the second of 5 seminars that we're going to be organizing. The third one is planned for sometime in July. So we have your email addresses because you registered for this event. We're going to communicate to you the exact details and time and date for that seminar. I will mention right now that it'll be majorly focused on that primary data collection effort that we mentioned and diving a little bit deeper into that data. So, our first seminar was sort of all the way up here around like U.S.-Canada relations and the history behind that. I think with this seminar, we got a little closer to home with Dufferin County and agriculture and rural context. Next seminar, we're going to dive even deeper into that and understand exactly what the vulnerabilities are and how we move forward. So look forward to seeing you all at the next one. Thank you.